So welcome everybody. I'm Steve Crowley with the Vermont chapter, a volunteer with the Vermont chapter of the Sierra Club. And I'll be your host tonight. And we've got a great show lined up, a great discussion with Kim Hayden, who's an attorney who's worked on utility issues for quite a while and is very familiar with Hydro-Quebec and the carbon impacts of that. And Bill Bender, who's with SolarFlex Energy, solar entrepreneur in the Upper Valley. So we should have a great discussion tonight. And that's about it. I'm going to pass it right along to Bill. Bill, while you get your slides up, let me just also say, so you could go ahead and do that. And so, you know, the routine, everybody, I'm sure you do, that you want to stay on mute until it's your turn to talk. Feel free to put questions in the chat box. We will actually hold off on questions until both Bill and Kim have had a chance to present. And that'll be about 25 or 30 minutes after the hour. And then we will go into our discussion mode. So with that, I'll pass it along to Bill. Bill, welcome.
Well, thank you very much, Stephen. Thank you, everyone, for attending tonight. We appreciate having a conversation on these issues. My name's Bill Bender. I'm president of SolarFlex Energy. I grew up in Vermont, so I'm a long-time resident here. And I also have a PhD in economics. So you'll hear me talk about some economic issues, which are very much entwined with this. The thing about the climate change and carbon is to recall that carbon is central to everything in our economy. So it's fundamentally an economic issue. If you go back to the Industrial Revolution and coal, you know, in the 1800s, that was really all started with fossil fuels. It's integral to everything we do. So if we decarbonize our economy, it is affecting everything in our economy. So we do have to always keep that in mind. There's nothing easy here. So I think most people on this call understand that we're in a climate emergency. It's time to do something. If you look at the graph, it's pretty dramatic. But what's even more dramatic is what happened in 2020. If you did not pay attention to the climate emergencies in 2020, and even already in 2021 with what happened in Texas, it's right front and center. So there's a lot of urgency here. So the question is really, is Vermont's electricity green? That's a fundamental question. Well, it depends upon who you ask. So let's take a view of some people that might consider it, and we'll kind of go through these one by one. If you ask Google, they'd say no. If you ask Apple, they'd say no. If you ask Green E Energy, and I'll explain who these people are, they'd say no. If you ask the 5 other New England states, they'd say no. But if you ask the powers that be in Vermont, that includes the Department of Public Service, the Public Utilities Commission, the main utilities in the state like Green Mountain Power, and even now the Agency of Natural Resources, the Air Quality and Climate Division, and even the Vermont Climate Council, which was just started up in December. It remains to be seen where they come out on this, but the initial indications of all these organizations is they say, yes, electricity is green and we're doing great. Well, let's take a look at that in more detail. So if we talk about Google, they talk about additionality, and that's in Kim, I think will also talk some about additionality. Additionality is fundamental in the Paris Climate Agreement. It's kind of a core concept. And it's the idea that you have to have something new. If we don't change things, if we don't build new things or change what we're doing, then nothing's going to change. If we do the same thing we did 20 years ago or 50 years ago or 100 years ago, nothing's going to change. So Google has committed to purchase energy only from newly constructed generation facilities and not take it from pre-existing facilities. Likewise, Apple, priorities given to the creation of new renewable energy projects. not taking away from existing renewable energy products available to others. So that concept of additionality or things being new is central to everything about the Paris Climate Accord and central to everything about solving the climate issues that we're facing. Green E is the nation's leading independent renewable energy certification and verification program. They have very specific rules, and to get certified as a Green E energy, it has to be from new projects and built within 15 years. So these are very specific standards. There's a reason these standards were developed. It's because that's what's necessary. You have to have new things to replace the fossil fuels that we're using for everything else. Likewise, all 5 New England states, as part of their other New England states other than Vermont, do not recognize large hydropower facilities. And this is a quote from ISO New England, the New England Grid, where just saying Vermont is unique. So it's the only one that will count large-scale hydropower in its renewable energy standards. But what about the Vermont bureaucrats? They're all, we're good. And we'll look at some of the specific data, but the Department of Public Service says this, the Public Utilities Commission says this, and certainly the utilities say this. You got to remember, the utilities have had a monopoly for well over 100 years. They've been in a very cushy position. They just don't like competition. It's really pretty simple. So take a look at this set of data in terms of, this is, was presented to the Vermont Climate Council, one of their first meetings of December 21st in 2020. And if you look at the line that says electricity supply and demand, and you look at the last 5, 6, 7 years, so look at that period like 2012 to 2016, we're using like 0.8 to up to 1, that's million metric tons of carbon that we were emitting from producing our electricity. And then you can see that in 2017, 2018, it went down pretty dramatically to 0.19 million metric tons. And if you look at that graph, you look at the top right corner of that graph, you see that, well, transportation seems higher, residential, which is like heating buildings, seems higher. So electricity is good, we don't have to worry about it. And this is basically what the state of Vermont is saying. But where did that and remember, those were in millions of metric tons. So if you go back, and so where did 620,000 metric tons of carbon go in 2 years? So we're talking about the 2016, which was 0.81, going down to the 2018 number of 0.19. That's a difference of 0.62 million metric tons, which is the same as 620,000 metric tons of carbon. So where did that carbon go? This would be great if we really got rid of 620,000 metric tons that we're emitting every year. Wouldn't that be wonderful? Okay, so what would have had to have happened? Well, we would have had to have built 1.5 gigawatts of solar, more than 5 times everything that's ever been built in the state of Vermont. It's a huge amount of solar. You would see 1.5 gigawatts of solar in Vermont. It would be a lot of acres. That did not happen. Okay, well, what else could have happened? Well, maybe we got rid of some of the cars. That obviously wouldn't have affected electricity, but just to get the scale of those numbers, you'd have to take 1/3 of Vermont's cars off the road for this to happen. So, did that actually happen? Well, I was trying to think, where could all those cars have gone? Well, I think if you look really carefully at this picture of Lake Champlain and we blow up with our little telescope, you can see in the middle of the lake, there's this massive pile of cars. So we got rid of all that carbon somehow, but it's just a mirage. Clearly, none of these things happened. It did not happen. There's nothing real. And as an economist, I think of there's a real economy and a paper economy, right? Those are 2 different things, and you have to worry about both. But when we're worried about the climate, all that matters is the real economy. Did carbon get reduced or not? If carbon isn't reduced, it doesn't matter. So this is a screenshot from the Green Mountain Power website. Well, how are we doing? Green Mountain Power says, this is our energy mix. In the fine print there, they say GM's energy supply is 94% carbon free. Isn't that great? No, that's a wonderful thing. Living in Vermont, we're awesome. Everything's good. And we're also 63% renewable. Wow. really good. What's the difference? Well, the difference is nuclear, which is carbon free, but not renewable. But yeah, it sounds great. Okay. Well, look at those nice pictures, you know, nice windmills, solar. We got a lot of windmills and solar. Wow, we must be doing a good job. Well, in that same set of data, solar is 2.2%. That's how much of our power is solar. Oh, well, 63% renewable. There must be a lot of wind. 0.0% wind. What? How does this happen? It's crazy numbers, right? I would use I would even call this a mild term, but a term would be just greenwashing, right? This is greenwashing. So let's look at also from their website. And there's the link to it. What is the Green Mountain Power, which provides power to somewhere between 70 to 80% of Vermonters? Where's their power come from? Well, it's 60, almost 2/3 or over 60% is hydro. Okay, 30% is nuclear. So almost all of it, those claims come from hydro and nuclear. They say 63% renewables. You can see right there, 61.5% of it is hydro, a little bit of solar, and then nuclear. So it's a good thing that we use hydro, but in New England, only 4% of all energy is from hydro. So, you know, it's a sort of like, you know, at Thanksgiving dinner, if you take all the turkey, you know, is that a fair thing to do? If we take all the hydro and just try to count that, are we doing our share of contributing to solving the climate problem? You know, no, we're not. These are all 20th century facilities. There's not new hydro. There's a teensy bit of hydro being built in Quebec, but almost all of this is 20th century. And even some of these hydro facilities are literally 19th century. They're built in the 1880s and 1890s. 20th century dams and 20th century nuclear plants, those are all built in the 70s and 80s. They do not address climate change. There's no change. If we're using facilities that are 20 years old, 50 years old, or 100 years old, nothing changes. We used them 50 years ago, we use them now, same amount of carbon is emitted in the entire economy. So, and Kim will go into this kind of detail a lot more, but Vermont's the only state in New England that accepts this old hydro as counts it as clean. There are a lot of reasons we shouldn't. One of the reasons is look at that map from Vermont, and round numbers is about 6 million acres, and Hydro-Quebec has flooded 6 million acres. So the amount of water the amount of land that their dams have flooded is basically about the same size as the entire state of Vermont. And when you flood forests, you release a lot of methane, which is way more toxic or potent greenhouse gas than carbon. And that gets emitted a lot more initially than later, but still you're emitting a lot of carbon into the atmosphere as those trees decompose. So what we've done is we're essentially shuffled paper around. We have not actually reduced real carbon. If we just take on ownership of dams that other people have used before, but we count them as, that does not make the planet more sustainable and does not reduce carbon emitted into the atmosphere. So you can see the graph here that what happened is we started buying these attributes from Hydro-Quebec, which would not be counted by Google, would not be counted by Apple, would not be counted by Green E, would not be counted by 5 other New England states. So buying these attributes of renewable attributes from Hydro-Quebec is really inexpensive because no one else will do it. So what we're essentially doing is some arbitrage. And again, Kim will talk a little bit more about that. But we do have some more than the 2.2% solar and 0.0% wind in Vermont. We do have some solar and wind, but we sell all of that to Massachusetts and Connecticut. So we're essentially exporting that energy, that in itself is a good thing. But what's not a good thing is then pretending that we're actually doing something about our own power. What we're doing is everything we're building is basically counting in Massachusetts and Connecticut and other states, but we're not actually doing something for our own carbon reductions. What we're doing is trading paper around on 20th century facilities, and that is not helping the planet. So this is actually very costly. And the reason it's costly is because, and it's happening right now. I just got some questions from journalists today about the Great River Hydro. Green Mountain Power just announced they're buying some of the dams on the Connecticut River. So they're doing even more of this beyond the data that's shown already. So why is that costly? Well, hydro is great. It's a good resource. We should definitely use it. But like I said, it's only 4% of the power for all of New England. So we need to build new things to get rid of the fossil fuels. There's 48% of New England's power is from natural gas. And what's happening is the utilities are very successfully convincing the bureaucrats in Vermont that just by moving these pieces of paper around is a good thing. And it's actually costly. In the state spreadsheets, solar net metering is going to 0 in 6 years. So the ability of Vermonters to put in solar because they want to reduce their carbon emissions is going to disappear. That's official state policy, is for it to go away. And we have a sin tax in Vermont. People don't think of it that way, but again, as an economist, these fees are taxes. There's a 34% sin tax, and you have to call any tax that's up in that kind of range of sin tax. The only tax I know of that's higher in Vermont is a tax on cigarettes. So you tax things like cigarettes that high. But solar is a good thing. It's reducing carbon. And we have a 34% tax on self-consumed solar starting in September in Vermont. And that's a direct result of the greenwashing that's going on by the utilities and indirectly, and also the state government. So this is really costly because it's shutting down the opportunity of Vermonters to actually truly reduce carbon. When an individual household or an individual business puts in solar, they are in fact reducing total carbon because that energy had to come from somewhere. And the only thing that the nuclear plant's not going to turn off, the hydro plant's not going to turn off, the thing that's going to turn off is a natural gas plant. And so when you put in solar, you are in fact reducing the amount of carbon emissions. So there's really 3 things that have to be done to address the climate crisis. We have to electrify. In Vermont, only 18% of our energy use is electricity. The other 82%, largely transportation and heating, has to ultimately be electrified. So, and if we're going to electrify that, where's that power going to come from? It can't come from more 20th century facilities. There aren't more dams going in. There aren't more nuclear plants. So we have to be building renewable energy. And we can improve efficiency, but we're not going to improve efficiency enough to take care of all the extra demand we're going to have for electrification. So we have to build renewables. We have to get away from this greenwashing that's going on in Vermont. So thanks very much. Appreciate your comments. I look forward to your questions, I should say.
I know. So my name is Kim Hayden. I'm a renewable energy lawyer, the head of Paul Frank & Collins Energy and Environmental Group. I've been working in the energy industry for several decades or more. And I have some overlap with what Steve has just said. I'm going to try to stay within some of the time constraints that I've been given. Steve, if you don't mind changing to the next slide. So this slide just speaks to obviously the urgency that Bill just spoke about. And I know you're probably all very aware of the IPCC special report, but to stay below the 1.5 degree increase in warming potential, we need to reduce our carbon, it's not just our carbon footprint, our greenhouse gas footprint by 45% from 2010 levels by 2030. And if you go to the next slide, Bill or Steve, if you don't mind, we're already experiencing some of the disastrous effects of climate change that will only worsen over time. NASA website has some video clip that you can watch that just shows the progression over time, and I would recommend that. If you don't mind going to the next slide, Steve. Vermont, we're not on course to reduce our emissions at all. We haven't, this is a relatively old slide, but it's not misrepresentative of where we are today. We were supposed to have reduced our emissions from a 1990 baseline, years ago, and we're moving in the wrong direction. We're not moving in a better direction. If you don't mind, Steve, we could go to the next slide. The pie chart you see on the left was from, it looks like a slightly different year than the chart that Bill showed you. It's still pretty representative of Green Mountain Power's resource option or resource mix. And again, 60% hydro, a lot of that is actually the utilities, the power that they consume. There are 3 different products, but 2 of them, one is energy and then the other is the environmental attribute. A lot of what you're seeing in that 60% is what I would refer to as an environmental attribute only. It doesn't reflect underlying energy. It's the paper that Bill was referring to, that you paper that attribute with a fossil fuel plant, and together the paper attribute is supposed to kind of wash over the underlying fossil fuel. That's essentially what the Vermont RES allows in our Tier 1 RES. We as a state also import the vast majority of the power that Vermonters consume. And that's just data from the EIA. And by the way, I'll say I have a lot of data in the slide deck. It will be, I guess, circulated tomorrow or made available tomorrow, but I have sources and everything in this slide deck. So I'm not going to speak to everything. Steve, if you don't mind, the next one. So Bill referred to the ISO New England. I think he had a quote dropped in that shows how Vermont stands out compared to our sister states that have true renewable energy or renewable portfolio standards. And this, it's hard to see it on this slide deck, but the bottom, there's the source to the ISO website, the bottom left. They actually have been showing this in their annual report year after year. And Vermont, as you can see, is not one of the graphics on the slide deck. It's actually set aside and described as being unique, and in large part because of the large hydro that Vermont counts, especially the old large hydro. If you could go to the next slide, Steve. This slide quotes from Dr. Hager, MIT professor, work that he did and testimony he submitted to the Army Corps of Engineers in connection with the proposal to bring down a lot of new hydro through Maine. And this, I'm not going to go into length into Dr. Hager's work or his assessment of the peer-reviewed literature, but what he does explain is that when you look at all of the 68 or so facilities that comprise that system, about 25% of them are among the world's dirtiest gas emitters, greenhouse gas emitters. And that has a lot to do with the vintage of some of those resources. Some have been recently deforested, and they flooded out large areas that have caused deforestation, and we're seeing very high emissions in the first 5 to 10 years. The Department of Environmental Conservation in Vermont has acknowledged that they, in their carbon accounting, they have attributed 0 carbon footprint to the Hydro-Quebec resource. If you don't mind, Steve, the next slide. This is a graphic that Dr. Hager introduced in connection with his testimony, and it kind of puts in relative terms the greenhouse gas emissions, the carbon footprint of some of these resources, these hydropower resources compared to other. And you can see that this is not a zero, these are not 0 carbon footprint resources by any measure. Steve, we can go to the next slide. Along with that, we know that several indigenous tribes are also now suing Hydro-Quebec because that massive flooding, what Steve showed to be, or what Bill showed to be equivalent to the state of Vermont. It's displaced many indigenous tribes in Quebec, disruption that has never really been addressed by the state of Vermont. And, you know, do we have true kind of racial equity principles associated with our power purchase procurements? We can go to the next slide. And this is just some information and illustration of the damming. And then at the same time, some of these same communities that are hosting these facilities are having to be forced to rely on dirtier power to fuel their communities. Next slide, Steve. So this arbitrage concept of what we're doing, how we're taking the hydropower attributes and papering that attribute to in order to meet our renewable energy standards. Green Mountain Power in particular had a very strategic plan that they began in around 2015. This is from their last rate case. You know, at the time that the renewable energy standard was put into place, it allowed these older facilities and also allowed that they be used by the utilities as a standalone product to combine with a dirtier resource. So their plan starting in 2015 was to use the drop in market fuel price, which i.e. is code for these are gas prices, lock in significant cost savings by buying that and then adding in very low cost tier 1 RECs, which referring to the attributes in this case if they're Hydro-Quebec, when available. The next slide is from the Department of Public Service to the legislature in a presentation last year. Steve, if you don't mind. This is directly from their slide deck to the legislature. And you can see on the right, the department explains this REC arbitrage is in 2018, Green Mountain Power would use a $27 REC from KCW, that's Kingdom Community Wind, our largest wind project in Vermont, or a $1 REC from Hydro-Quebec HQ for tier 1 compliance. Least cost principles suggest using the $1 REC and selling the KWC REC to Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island REC markets. And that's what REC arbitrage is, that's what's happening in Vermont. And the reason that these $1 RECs from HQ have no value is because they do nothing, there's no market for them other than Vermont, and they do nothing to reduce carbon emissions. Let's go to the next slide. And again, so why is an arbitrage in this form wrong? Because it violates climate policy. And it, Bill has already talked about a lot of this. I looked at some other explanations along with those that Bill was looking at. And the first one, so this was from a climate policy magazine. It was an article written around, why certain markets and environmental standards for electricity emissions require this concept of additionality. It's because if we just allow fictitious carbon units and units that do not represent real emissions reductions, then we are we're not doing anything to reduce or decarbonize, reduce our footprint. And I look at it this way, really. We talk a lot about the renewable energy. Is this true renewable energy? Hydro, to some degree, smaller units may have a small carbon footprint, but overall, if you're using a very old vintage generator that's been in the New England system for a decade, 2 decades, 3 decades, a century, it's the emissions profile of the New England system, of the ISO New England system, is staying stagnant. It doesn't matter if we're trading the attributes from that same hydro unit. And it's a concept that confuses people to some degree, but I think the metric should be, is the generation that is being procured by the utilities actually causing an emission reduction? Or are we staying at that baseline level that the earlier slide showed for Vermont? If we're not actually causing an emission reduction, and the only way that can be achieved is if you have additional new resources that displace the older resources, starting with the dirtiest ones, then we're not changing our emissions profile. Let's go to the next slide. I think I threw in some extra slides. So this is additionality continued. And again, this will be available, I think, on the your website, the Sierra Club website, as of maybe tomorrow. This, again, just discusses in more from additional resources why this concept of not having additionality is problematic. Next slide, please, Steve. So this goes to our massive imports. I mean, we import quite a bit of power from out of state, including the Hydro-Quebec contract represents our largest procurement, the current long-term Hydro-Quebec contract. And in doing that, and if we have additional procurements from out of state, we're relying on very old transmission grid and a network that is not distributed. And the Army Corps of Engineers has already given in 2017 a report card to the US grid of a D+. So if we continue with this pattern of importing big, large central station power, whether it's from large generators in Quebec or anywhere else, we're not doing what we need to make our grid more distributed and resilient, and incorporating new clean solar and wind. Let's go to the next one. So I worked on this case. So the left side is an illustration of the massive catastrophic failure of the Hydro-Quebec grid following the 1998 ice storm event. It was what was called a 100-year event. Well, I don't think it will be anymore. The insulators failed and the whole grid collapsed in a cascading failure. So the other reason we need local distributed resources like solar is so that we can rely on a more resilient local grid, microgrid, move away from the central station power, which is increasingly vulnerable. I'm just going to go really quickly and tell you what the next couple of slides reflect. So this is from GMP's FERC Form 1, which is like a financial disclosure statement to the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. They themselves have acknowledged that they have concentration risks created by our reliance on imported power. And some of that concentration risks resides with our heavy reliance on the Seabrook and the Millstone nuclear units, both of which are located in areas that are at risk of inundation. If we go to the next slide, inundation from water events. And this is from, Bloomberg wrote it up, the Union of Concerned Scientists wrote it up. Actually, the Senate sent a letter to the FERC, the Federal Energy, or not the FERC, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, very alarmed about this issue that we have along the East Coast and in other places. Old nuclear units of the Fukushima type reactor that are vulnerable. If they're inundated, they literally go into meltdown. And we in Vermont are importing a significant part of our power from these two units. That's not ever been investigated or questioned to my knowledge. I'll just say very quickly, the NRC, after Fukushima in 2011, embarked on a very significant investigation, and the staff came up with a report that required either shut these down or have more robust containment systems that are kind of foolproof as far as inundation. And when President Trump was elected, he replaced the chief of the the head of the NRC, replaced that person with one of his appointees, and they pulled back from the rule that they were going to put through rulemaking to address this issue. So this is still a very significant issue. Let's go to the next slide. That's another one. I think this is another slide. So we also have Wyman 4 and Stony Brook are both oil/gas burning units. Our utilities, GMP owns fairly significant shares of some of the outputs of these units in terms of just megawatts versus Vermont load. to my knowledge, it's never been questioned. There's no, you know, why do we continue to own portions of these outputs? Let's see if, I'm not sure that I have anything else. There might be a final slide there, Steve. So this is from a very recent filing from Green Mountain Power. It shows the gap between the energy that where the procurements they have to meet their energy load, their total Vermont energy load. The energy load is on the curve on the black at the top. That's the high peak scenario where there would be like a lot of electrification, whatever else would cause a major increase in load in Vermont. And then the dotted line is their expected curve for what load would be. I'm not going to read all of these, but where there's a pretty small amount of current and future solar that would meet that load. The green is the wind, very little of that. They do show their current Hydro-Quebec and nuclear fleet. So HQUS, this is just showing the current HQUS contract, which is about 30%, not the 60%. This slide does not reflect the RECs that are being purchased or attributes, the paper-only attributes that are being purchased to help them meet their tier 1 resource. So I think you can, I mean, the slide itself, I think reflects that a significant amount of what they're going to use to meet their renewable energy standard requirement will be very likely paper RECs. I'll just end it with that.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Wow, that's a lot to absorb, and it's very timely, as the Climate Council has prominently on its task list to figure out how we sort out our greenhouse gas inventory and what kind of rules we apply to it. So let's see if we've got some questions here. I'm going to more or less take it from the top, but go ahead and add it in the chat, and we'll see how quickly we can get through. The first question I see here is from Brian Forrest. Brian, a question about the 34%. You want to clarify your question?
The 34% tax on self-consumed solar. That's a new law that's going into effect? Is there some, can you give us more information on that so we can?
Sure, I can explain that. And that's starting in September. So there was a PUC decision at the end of the past year, and the first part of it went into effect in beginning of February, and the rest of it is September. If we back up a little bit, when we first started selling solar, which was 2013, all of our customers got an extra 6 cents bonus, and that was state policy to encourage solar at the time. And in order to get a 6 cents bonus on your solar, you put a production meter in where the solar is. So you calculated all the kilowatts of solar that was produced. And some of that goes into the house and gets used, or if it's a business, goes into the business and gets used. And then some of that goes out into the grid. And then other times, some comes in from the grid, and that's the net metering. Most all states, when they net meter, there's a lot of states have debates about how do you set these rates, and is there a different rate for importing or exporting power. But Vermont is kind of unique in having this production meter, which started out as a good thing to have this bonus. But they have over the years, that bonus has gone down and down and down. Now it's gone negative. So they have what they call, the way that bonus has gotten structured in the last couple of years is there's a site adjuster. So that idea of that is to incent solar to be where they want it, especially more commercial fields. So for example, you get more money if you put it in a gravel pit than if you put it in farmland. And also depending upon what happens to the renewable energy credits. So if you put in solar at your house or at your business, and think particularly for all of Vermont's businesses that are distributed outside of Vermont and claim, they have the Vermont attributes, right? They're green, they're clean, and some businesses want to say that they're produced with solar energy. If you want to do that, then you have to keep those renewable energy credits. If you do that in a residential site, they take 1 cent away from you for just being in a residential site. They take 4 cents for the renewable energy credits if you want to keep those. And then of course there's the energy efficiency charge. But the energy efficiency charge is generally charged, when you consume electricity from the power, or from the grid. If you consume solar, from the utility's perspective, it's really no different than if you install energy efficient light bulbs or other energy efficiency improvements. You reduce your what you consume from the grid. But with solar, because of that legacy production meter that's still required, now that you have to pay 6 cents, even if you use that energy in your house, and even if you install a battery and use a lot of that energy in your house. So that's 34% over 18 cent, or a little bit less than 18 cents is the GMP rate. So 6 cents out of the 18 cents. There's like New Hampshire, for example, there is no production.
Bill, let's go on to some other questions, okay?
Sure thing.
Can we do that?
Yeah.
As much appreciated. I noticed that you included a comment in the chat that goes to this also.
Yes. Right.
But thanks. Let's see. We have, let's see, Rob has pointed out that he's going to be posting the recording tomorrow. So everybody should be able to see that online. And I think he mentioned that he would email it to everybody who's here. Let's see. Lee, you want to mention something about Washington Electric?
Yes, I do. I'll just make it brief. Washington Electric says that they're 100% renewable because they're burning the gas from the Coventry landfill in diesel generators. And I don't know, I think it's better than just venting the gas out into the atmosphere, but we're still contributing to the carbon load. So they're generating more than they need. So they have decided that they're going to start charging in their rates where you're going to have a minimum charge that is double and will be triple at their next one of what they were doing before. And I installed solar panels about 4 years ago, and I based that upon what the rates, I thought the rates were going to be. Now my bill's going to be up to just about what it was before I installed the solar panels. And that with the 34% send tax and the user charge increases that Washington Electric has done, because they're really trying to take away any incentive for people to put in the solar panels at their house. And to me, that is not the way we should be going. And I just wanted to put it out there. I know Washington Electric is not one of the big generators in the state, but even the smaller ones are trying to discourage the use of home solar panels. Thank you.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Let's go to Nathaniel.
Steve, Bill and Kathy, thanks for your great presentations. I'm just wondering if you two could comment on what you think our electricity generation mix should be going forward. It's currently a very small percent of solar and a smaller percentage of wind. And I'm curious if you can comment on what place, if any, you think hydro should have in our mix if we're going to meet our state greenhouse gas emission goals.
So in my view, having worked with the utilities and their portfolios over the years, if you remember the last slide in the slide deck, which was a GMP slide from their recent a recent filing for a procurement, they've got a large gap, and so there's room to add more energy. I think it should be new renewable Vermont-based. A lot of it should be Vermont-based because that helps us with our resiliency problem that we've got. And just looking at the well, we've got a D+ from the Army Corps of Engineers for our large transmission grid. Our ties to Hydro-Quebec come down via it's less than a 500 kW. It's this relatively small set of lines that bring power down currently from Hydro-Quebec. There are some projects being proposed, like the Main Connect, to have like 1,000 megawatts coming down. But I think that the reason a local resilient distributed grid is so important, and that could be solar and wind. But we have a wind sound rule now that has noise levels so low that there hasn't been any wind added in Vermont since that was passed, the rule was passed. We bring in a more vibrant climate economy. All of these like Sun Commons and Solaflect, they are adding to a very vibrant economy. And at the same time, you could include some microgrid installation measures like the fiber and the things that could, really make the grid speak to each other. Meaning your appliances, and I'm really simplifying this, but that's your appliances, your battery charger for your car, for something in your home. It's literally speaking back and forth with the grid. That you don't get that when you have these very large imports over high voltage transmission lines. And if we don't do something to improve our grid, we're not going to achieve that modern grid. I did have a slide in my presentation that kind of spoke to that, and that's a whole topic in itself. I think we're over dependent on hydro, and I saw there was a comment about that. And this isn't my concern about the REC arbitrage that's happening is that a lot of this is old vintage, and so there's no additionality. We're not reducing our carbon profile, our emissions profile by basically buying a piece of paper from something that's been existing and generating for years. A new hydro resource would certainly bring that additionality. A hydro resource also can be very useful in the sense for Hydro-Quebec, for example, it's a 24/7. It's not interruptible because they've got such a large fleet. I don't think that should count towards, however, as a carbon reduction resource. If it's something that's been in the mix for a generation or centuries, or a century, it's not a generation resource that is reducing our carbon footprint. And so that's what we need to be adding in now to actually, and I actually think we should, instead of calling it the renewable energy standard, we should be calling it or adding to it an energy or emissions reduction standard. We should have resources that we know will achieve actual emissions reductions. And those are solar, those are wind, primarily. And that's my personal view of this. We have 120 megawatt solar project in Vermont. All of that power, all of the attributes are being sold into New England. The reason there's only 2.2 megawatts of solar shown on the GMP slide is that we have more than that installed in state, but most of it has been sold by the utilities out of state as part of that REC arbitrage. They sell the RECs, it's called stripping away the RECs from the resource. It then takes on the system mix attributes of the New England system, which is largely natural gas, and it's then called null power. So I think we should be retaining the RECs from our projects that we're building now, and we should be building out in that energy gap resources that are local, primarily local. Some out of state is okay, but we shouldn't be highly dependent on that in a way that precludes us from modernizing our grid.
I could just add a couple of things to that. Is hydro's a great resource, but we should think in terms of how many renewables need to be built in a New England context or a Northeastern North America context or Northeastern US context. And if you put it in that context, we need a lot more renewables, and Vermont should build its share. And we're the second most land abundant state east of the Mississippi. We should have more than other states because we have the land. The other thing is Hydro-Quebec is potentially super useful resource. There's essentially a year of New England power is how much their storage capacity is. So they have a huge potential benefit of actually, instead of just being a base load, of actually, now there's environmental issues if you have more of the sort of peaking loads, but it's a huge battery resource. And that's really how it can be used to help make it, to get a much higher percentage of solar and wind into the grid. And if you tie those things all together, then that's a really useful resource. And that's the planning that should be going on. And I don't hear people talking about looking at it that way and figuring out how to mitigate the environmental issues by, and still be able to use it in that manner.
One thing that I would add to that is that it's important to keep in mind that if we're talking about additionality, it happens to be the newest hydro projects that put out the most CO2 and methane. So it's the first, gradually that level gradually decreases over decades. And some of the newer ones, and it depends if it's a broad flat reservoir area and they don't strip the biomass away before they flood it, then all that biomass is gradually decaying. And also, by the way, adding methyl mercury to the river downstream, but that is coming back. And we're talking about an ecosystem that has been storing up carbon for millennia. I don't know how much of that will go away, but certainly what's on the surface will gradually go away and go back into the air. So that's years and years worth going right back in the air. So and similarly, when you use the reservoir in an up and down way as a battery, as opposed to seasonal changes that might happen normally, like we see with Lake Champlain, then you mobilize a lot more methane, and it's not just CO2 anymore. It's methane that goes in that raising and lowering of the water and in the battery mode. So I guess I'm a big fan of let's count the carbon.
Yeah, I think that, and just for, intellectual honesty, we should be counting the carbon, because we're within the next 10 years, we face a tipping point. We certainly, we're reaching a tipping point if we don't do more. I would add that the current Hydro-Quebec contract, because I worked on that, that contract, I said there were 3 attributes. So three products that you get when you buy power, or 3 attributes. There are 3 products that are created when you produce and generate power. It's the energy, the actual kilowatt hours that we use to turn on the lights, the capacity, which essentially is like, it's the backup for the intermittency of the resource, and the environmental attribute. The current Hydro-Quebec US contract, which is again about 30% of that what powers Vermont right now. The GMP chose, the utilities, it wasn't just GMP, it was almost all the state utilities chose not to buy the capacity, which is that backup that Bill was referring to. So we chose not to have the battery, essentially that hydro battery sitting there and available, and instead, we just bought the energy. And I do agree also with what you just said, Steve, that within the next 10 years, if you think about our time frame that we need to start moving quickly to carbon reduction, the newest hydro resources that are in the Hydro-Quebec system mix, the newest generators and set of reservoirs are going to be the dirtiest. So that's concerning. It needs to be evaluated very much from that carbon footprint additionality. And I'll just add to that if we're going to be papering that energy gap at the last page of my slide deck with a lot of Hydro-Quebec RECs only, then we know, and there's no additionality. And if we're using that electricity, if that's what our electricity really looks like, is like we're staying flat or maybe going down in terms of our decarbonization attempt on the electricity sector. The same will be true with respect to the transportation and thermal sectors that would be fueled by or powered by that same electricity. So just electrifying the transportation and the thermal or heating sector does not get the job done if the third leg of the stool, the most important, the backbone of the stool, whatever, if that's not a clean resource that's fueling these other sectors. So that's a little bit off point, but I don't think either of us talked about that, and it's a really important point.
Okay, well, I know we're not going to get to everybody here. John is next. John has brought up the point. He's kind of brought up a couple of points. One in support of hydro, and another separating that out from the REC sales, which I think Kim has addressed a lot. Do you want to add to that, John?
Yeah, well, I'm opposed to this whole, cap and trade kind of systems, which just are paper shuffling and don't address the problem. On the other hand, some things that are said about Hydro-Quebec, I mean, yeah, there are environmental damages with hydro, certainly. A lot of it, I found it very weird that they said, oh, these are 20th century facilities. That's actually good because they're no longer emitting in the way that they used to do. They've also learned a lot in terms of, I mean, nowadays they don't just flood a forest and let the timber go to rot. They cut it down, so on and so forth. And I don't think there's anything new on the horizon from Hydro-Quebec in terms of building new dams, so on and so forth. But there's a lot of, if renewable energy is going to be electrical energy almost overwhelmingly, and it's especially important if we consider that we want to put our transport system on electrical energy. So we're going to need as much electrical energy as we can muster. My criticisms of Hydro-Quebec have to do with their policies of how they price their energy. In Quebec, it costs 4 cents per kilowatt hour to get, for a household. I mean, in Vermont, it's what, 17 cents? They're radically underpricing their electricity and they're overusing it in Quebec. And this is tremendously wasteful. Quebec has about Hydro-Quebec has about 37,000 megawatts of capacity. And if you add in the upper Churchill dams, which were basically, they're marketed to Hydro-Quebec and they're basically Hydro-Quebec projects, it's about, 5.5 extra megawatts. I mean, that's a huge amount of electricity, yet the peak electricity use in Quebec is in the middle of the winter. It's 39,000 megawatts, which means that the households there and business are incentivized to waste a huge amount of this resource. They should, and mind you, Hydro-Quebec is a publicly owned utility. It's what Canadians call a crown corporation. All the money that Hydro-Quebec does not reinvest goes back to the citizens of Quebec. And they're getting cheap electricity, but they're also wasting that cheap electricity. It would be much better if they would use this resource in basically raising the electricity prices that households and businesses pay. And at the same time, they get the money back one way or another, the citizens of Quebec. But it would be just like a carbon tax, it would reduce the wasteful use of this electricity resource. And we need as much electricity as we can get. I agree with the idea that you want to diversify the grid, but you also want to get the power into the grid. And diversifying the grid is a difficult problem and it requires a lot of investment, which is not going to come from the state of Vermont. It's going to have to come from the federal government, basically, to really implement this.
I can't remember a topic that we've done that inspired so many long questions and comments. It's not even close. But everybody's got really good points. But it's a complex issue, isn't it? And electricity is one little string.
If you deal with electrical engineering, you talk to electrical engineering, it's really complex. You don't understand the half of it. So,
every new thing I learn about 3 things that I don't know. Suzanne, we're going to go to you. you have a question. Let's see, about replacing, weaning itself Vermont. I think it's interesting to see Kim's last slide there that showed a lot of those contracts dropping off in another decade or two. So your question, Suzanne?
Yeah, so to keep the energy local, and I'm thinking, how can it wean off of Hydro-Quebec? And how can we keep it local? How can that be done without any more opposition that is already heavily in place? Wind turbines, I'm thinking mainly of Lowell, the Lowell Ridge turbines. Everybody hated those. A lot of deforestation happened to have those be put up there. And yes, it's cute to have the solar panels, and then everybody's on a roof, but we live in Vermont. Not every single house can actually withhold a solar panel, or they'd have to have a new roof put on. So just what are some ways to kind of like get into the nitty gritty logistics, the unglamorous side of weaning Vermont off of electricity from Hydro-Quebec?
Sure, I can talk about that. Well, it certainly is, and I appreciate all these great comments. It certainly is a complicated topic, and it's not easy, and it's not easy for the utilities either. But in terms of Hydro-Quebec, there's sort of two components to Hydro-Quebec. One is an actual contract for power and a power line that comes down from Canada. We've gotten that power since, Kim could say, what, early 1990s, something like that. That's something like 25% of Vermont's power. That is probably something we should just accept, and okay, that's good while we have that contract. The bigger problem now is that there's are these attributes that we're buying in this arbitrage process, where we're buying these attributes from Hydro-Quebec for almost nothing. We're not actually getting the real power. We're just pretending we're renewable, and that's the piece that we really should get rid of. Certainly, as you know, being involved with the solar company, I'm kind of biased. There's a huge opportunity for solar, and where that is really dramatic is as people electrify cars, and that's happening really slowly now. But if you saw the Super Bowl, the GM, General Motors, had an ad attacking Norway, saying, "We're coming after you, Norway." Well, Norway is 54% EVs, the sales in 2020. 54% EVs, a quarter hybrid, and only a quarter old-fashioned cars. Volvo, so GM has announced they're going to be all electric by 2035. Volvo just in a week or two ago announced they're going to be all electric by 2030. So this is happening in a really short time frame. When all of Vermont's cars are electric, we have a week of storage. A week of power is stored in the cars sitting in the state. So right there, that gets rid of a lot of the concerns utilities have in terms of intermittency. You know, you have a cloudy day or you have night. It gets rid of the entire problem of nights for solar, for example, just by having EVs sitting in your driveway. So as we do that, as people put in solar on the roof, and if there wasn't this 34% tax, you know, in our experience, selling solar to hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of Vermonters, there are a lot of Vermonters who really want to reduce their carbon footprint, and they also want power. And if you saw what happened in Texas, you know, for good reason, people like the idea of having some control and some power close to them, so a small battery and solar gives you a lot of flexibility. As soon as you get some EVs in your driveway, you're going to have a week of power sitting in your driveway. It's going to be a huge opportunity there. And also as people electrify, our solar customers are very attuned to issues in terms of what do we have to change in our breaker panel in order to put in an EV, things like that. There's also community solar, which for people who don't own their own house, used to be really viable. We did build community solar every year for 4 years until the state made it basically impossible. We had a lot of renters and lower income Vermonters that chose to go solar that way. They still wanted to do it and made it very viable to add a little bit of solar at a time with community solar. And Vermont has basically made that virtually impossible. There's very little of that happening now. So it's really state policy. With state policy, we can get back on track. So talk to your legislator.
Yeah. No, and I get that. I know that solar is a way to do it, but I mean, it does take up land, even with the solar panels and solar communities that are coming up, and it's great, but it does take up land. And that's, I didn't know about the cars. That's amazing. But you still need to charge those cars. Like, there's always an ugly side to things in this town. Like, it's definitely an ugly side. Just how can it be prettier?
Well, there's you know, for energy use, we're good at exporting our problems in the U.S. You know, so or exporting them to lower income neighborhoods. So, you know, all the oil infrastructure tends to be in really low income neighborhoods and largely people of color as well. Or we send it overseas, you know, so or you go to the strip mines in Montana or Wyoming, or look at the mountaintops missing in West Virginia, or the fracking now and some of the chemicals going into groundwater in Pennsylvania. I mean, energy does make a big mess. Looking at a few windmills or solar farms, in my mind, is a dramatically less impact than anything else we're doing by far. But you do need a mix. We're going to need hydro, we're going to need wind, we're going to need solar, and we're going to have, and we're going to need batteries. But I mean, cars is a huge opportunity there. Hydro-Quebec is an opportunity if we actually use it as a storage mechanism. We do have to combine the renewables with ways to manage it and store it. So it's a complicated future, but there are a lot of good options out there.
Kim, do you want to have a last word here?
Just very quickly, I mean, but yeah, so think about it. We own what we're consuming. That's something that's not visible to a lot of people. So we've got, you know, this flooding of large areas of, you know, occupied by indigenous communities, land that they've been on forever. We are consuming in Vermont natural gas from gas plants that are sitting next to some of the communities that Bill just referred to there, and we are consuming some coal in Vermont from communities that have essentially raped their land, or, you know, whose land has been raped. We are consuming a lot of nuclear in Vermont from plants that are, you know, have radioactive waste that will be there probably, you know, entombed. So it's not that we're, you know, there's an ugly side to the generation resource that for everything that we're consuming in Vermont. I mean, that's the reality of it. I think the least ugly is solar. It's very benign. I think wind can take up, you know, it has its positives and negatives, but we're talking about, we need to come to a carbon reduction, have a carbon reduction, almost an immediate reduction in our carbon footprint, not just in Vermont, but everywhere else. We should take more ownership of our carbon profile in Vermont instead of exporting it out of state, the reduction benefits that we are seeing and we are achieving, exporting that out of state through rec arbitrage, and masking over through these fake recs that we get from places like Hydro-Quebec, you know, and masking over the fossil fuels and other and nuclear, frankly. So it's not pretty, but that is the reality, and I think we have to do it very quickly.
Yeah, so solar is not as devastating, even though it does take up a lot of mass. Because I know, like Lowell, they totally deforested that ridge. There's massive roads. The whole ridge has been clear cutted out. So overall, solar is the best option.
Well, and we have
to leave it there.
Sorry, I could go on and on about this.
Yeah, I think we all could. I think this is one of our best attended sessions in a long time. So we'll have to come back to it. But I want to thank Kim and thank Bill for their great thoughts tonight. It's been a great discussion. And thank everybody who's been here to participate. Apologies to people that didn't get their questions asked, but we'll do it again. So thanks so much, everybody.